Hey, Herrst, Alter, was ist das?
Do you speak English?
What is this? What is all this for?
Oh, this is just for Schnitz and Giggles.
Schnitz and Giggles!
Welcome to Schnitz and Giggles, the podcast that stumbles upon the humor of cross-cultural confusion and life in Vienna, Austria, through the experiences of an Auslander and his Wiener.
Brought to you by the Edelweiss Crackers.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for the purpose of entertainment only and is not a replacement for therapy.
Well, guten hallo, and welcome back to the Schnitz and Giggles podcast. I'm Michael.
I'm Lucas.
And, yeah, good to be able to talk at you again.
Yes, there's some applause happening in the background.
Yeah, filming in front of a live studio audience today.
Yeah,
It's a live episode.
Yeah, people are not paying attention to us really, but it's still...
Yeah, it sounds about right.
It still sounds about
Kind
right.
of the constant in our audience is they're not really listening to us.
That's what it is, yeah.
Just put it on in the background.
That's the story of our life.
Yeah, sure is. Sure is.
Yeah, Michael, since you are an American, may I ask you a question from the American perspective?
Yeah, I'd love to answer that question.
Since you come from the great country of the US of A, how much influence of Austrian culture have you noticed in the States as you just grew up there, lived there?
Well, we had a governor.
Okay.
From in the great state of California.
He was pretty
He
influential.
was an influential Austrian who came over and taught us how to run things for a while, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one piece. But I don't think that's really what your question was.
No, not really. That's maybe not. It's more like a personal success story of a certain man, but
Correct.
not
I mean-
as in the whole culture.
Yeah, but isn't that what influence is personal successes
Sure.
of one man or woman?
I wonder if he changed things in California that have become like a permanent change and maybe also
Yeah.
Austrian influenced changes.
That's a good question.
But that is a really deep
It's a really good question. Yeah, I think we probably delve too far into politics if we talk about a politician that way.
Right. We're already going off topic.
We are. Yeah. I guess what your question makes me think of is, I mean, in America, because we are a country built on immigrants, or at least what the American culture is now, there's, these pockets of immigrant communities that hold on to their home country.
Mm-hmm.
Like we'll have like little parts of town that are named after the immigrant groups that are the country groups that moved into that area. And so there's those echoes of the motherland for these groups of people. But I don't think there's really that type of community that's like, or that type of thing that's very noticeable of like the Austrian diaspora in America. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah. I mean, one thing I did notice, that's the only thing I can maybe talk about as an outsider. I did notice that there are a couple of Viennas in the States.
That is true.
I think there's like 4 or 5
Yeah, there are.
towns that are called
I think
Vienna.
there's one in Virginia and
Mhm.
one in Texas.
Different
Yeah.
states. And I don't know if there's any Salzburg or any other place like that's not like Austrian
Yeah, I don't know.
town names, but
Yeah.
or any Innsbruck or like Graz.
Graz.
Yeah, but that certainly speaks about the history of the immigrants.
Yeah, I would
coming
imagine
to the States,
that's probably a spot where you could probably find some descendants of Austrian
Yeah.
immigrants for sure.
Have you ever been to one of the Viennas in the States?
I haven't. We drove past one in, I think it was Georgia. There's one in Georgia.
Georgia,
Yeah,
yeah,
I
cool,
think we drove right past it. We're like, oh, we could go home, but we were quite far away from home.
Too bad.
Yeah, I haven't visited any of the American Viennas.
It would be interesting to find out and say like walk up to the mayor and say Grüß Gott.
If there's, hey, grüße.
Servus.
Servus. Go. Yeah, I don't think we would get a positive response from that.
No, perhaps not.
That is one of the things that like you notice in certain places where there are these communities where there's these echoes of those places. And there doesn't seem to be a very large or vocal like Austrian American community. I mean, there's definitely Italian American groups, there's German American groups, but really not Austrian.
Yeah, you're missing out on something there.
Maybe it exists, but it's certainly not as vocal. Maybe it's because Austria is a smaller country. Maybe it's just a numbers
Perhaps.
game at that point. Like, are there elements of Austrian culture or Viennese culture that have somehow infiltrated American culture that we like really know of?
Well, I'm glad that you asked.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thanks. I came across a podcast the other day.
Okay.
And
Schnitz and Giggles podcast?
Well, yeah, that too. I
just stumbled upon it.
Hey,
who are these good-looking guys? Look like they're having a fun time.
Yeah. There's a podcast that's been around for some time, I think. I don't know how long. It's called the Freakonomics.
Oh, yeah. I'm familiar.
Freakonomics Radio Book Club, I think it's even called.
Yeah.
And
a very popular book, decade or so ago.
So they seem to just interview authors of books, if my understanding is correct, about their format as a podcast.
Yeah.
And there's one episode I could recommend to all of us. It's called How Does the Lost World of Vienna Still Shape Our Lives?
Okay.
So if you Google that, if you just look for that, How Does the Lost World of Vienna Still Shape Our Lives?
Yeah.
You will hear a very interesting episode. I think it's it's an hour-long episode. Okay. The host is interviewing this British historian called Richard Cockett.
Yes.
And he wrote a book about Vienna during a certain time period, the late 19th and the early 20th centuries.
Okay.
What he found is very, very astonishing and very interesting, even from an American point of view, I'd say, not just from an Austrian point of
I'll
view.
be the judge of that.
Don't worry, I already made the judgment for you.
Okay. It's very American of you.
Yeah, like I know what's good for you.
You're really learning.
Yeah, we're learning. We'll bring you peace.
Proud of you.
Oh my. So if you want to listen to this podcast, it's very like the actual host says on the show, he says this book is not a great read. But like if you take it out of context, it sounds really bad. But what he meant to say is it's not like a book that you just read like a novel.
Oh, okay.
It's more like a dictionary.
Yeah.
More like a informational book.
Yeah.
So it's not that kind of book that you just maybe read before you go to sleep or something. So their approach on that podcast is a very academic one, I would say.
Okay.
But if you want to listen to some details, we can only recommend this episode to you. But I was thinking maybe we could dumb it down because we're not that smart, perhaps, to figure out.
We'll try. See if we can dumb something down.
Yeah. If we're smart enough to
we're pretty good to dumb it down. I don't know if we can figure it out necessarily, but maybe we'll do our best.
Yeah, but pointing out a few of these things that made Vienna special in its historical significance. Maybe you should listen to it too and tell me what you think about it.
All right, I will right now.
Okay. All right. What do you think?
Yeah, that was pretty interesting episode.
Yes.
Yeah, I liked it.
So what are your takeaways?
Actually, I think it does fit in nicely with that question you asked. Now I know why you asked it.
Uh-huh.
That really, there's a lot of ways that Vienna itself was pretty influential in some things that we now would see as maybe like very specifically American cultural things. He talked a little bit about the impact of Austrians who had left Vienna just prior to World War II or just right after the Anschluss or whatever, that had influence on Hollywood and how a lot of different areas of kind of the growth of Hollywood and popular culture that way was driven by these influential Austrians. So that was something I certainly didn't know.
Right.
Still not sure how much I know or do not know about it because I didn't recognize any of the names. So I'll take his word for it that these people were influential. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I think I knew, pretty sure I knew this, that the concept of the shopping mall was invented by an Austrian. Crowd's excited about that.
Shopping mall. Maybe they disagree.
No, they can't believe it. How could the American institution of a shopping mall be invented by an Austrian?
This is turning into a riot here.
Yeah, we need to calm our audience down a little bit, but
our heritage.
But just that idea of something that like at least in popular culture when I was growing up, the mall was kind of a central figure of like, it sounds horrible, but doesn't sound horrible, but it's just like of high school society, right? Like it's the place we would go hang out. We'd go to the movies. We'd go just walk around, and there wasn't a lot of. That was just and there were movies that were based around that concept too, right? Like there was a famous movie, or not very famous movie called Mallrats, comedy.
Never heard of it.
Never heard of it.
What's it called?
Mallrats.
Mallrats,
yeah.
Okay.
Kevin Smith.
King of Queens type guy?
No, that's Kevin James.
That's Kevin James.
We're turning into a Kevin podcast.
Kevin. Yeah. The guy that's like Home Alone?
No, Kevin McAllister.
Okay. Or the one with the bacon.
The one with the bacon.
Isn't there someone called Kevin Bacon?
Kevin Bacon. Got me on that one.
Ah,
Yeah. Kevin Mitchell, outfielder for the Giants.
no idea.
Yeah.
I only know Kevin Costner.
Huh. Tatanka. All right. Well, we're not a podcast about Kevin.
We're not Dancing with the Wolves here.
No. Oh man, I wish I was quick enough to have something good.
We can always pretend. I can just
edit it in
edit out
later.
like it's this long pause.
Yeah.
It's like, whoa, he's witty. He's witty. He's fast.
Wow, what a clever guy. Yeah, we're talking about
where were
shopping
we?
malls.
Shopping malls.
Shopping malls. Yeah, just
Yeah.
that now, ironically, shopping malls are kind of dying off in the States,
Mm-hmm.
where they're now, these big areas that were being used as malls are now being torn down or turned into with other purposes. But over here in Vienna, they seem to be building new malls all the time. And there's, bigger malls that pop up and are very popular places to go, or crowded with people at all hours of the day, it seems. So it's now like this full circle of, it started with a concept that I'm not sure all the details of this Viennese architect that started the shopping mall, if he just like left Vienna and started this up in the States, or if he like started toying around with the concept of a mixed store shopping area. But now that it's coming back and being a part of Austrian culture is interesting, because most people would think maybe like, oh, this American way of doing shopping malls is
That's so American.
now polluting. It's so American, but it's actually, a very uniquely Viennese thing.
Yeah, his name was Victor Gruen, or Gruen, if you pronounce it the American way, I guess, or something like that. Yeah, the funny thing is that the thing about the shopping malls is, of course, what you have to consider is the dimensions would be fairly smaller back in the day. The one thing that anyone would say, like, it's super obvious, but someone had to invent it in the first place, is that I think this guy invented something called the Kaufhaus.
Okay. Yeah.
So Kauf means to buy, and house is just a house, like a house.
Like a big hall
of a house full of stores.
Yeah.
So before that idea, there was only like, you have one baker, you have one tailor, you have one, and so on and so on.
Yeah.
But he was the first to say, well, let's put them all into one big building. And that was maybe like just really literally just a house, like an apartment house size.
And it's a concept that isn't like, it's not like he thought up the concept on his own, because the idea of a market where you would go to find the things you wanted to buy is something that predated him. But maybe this idea of having it enclosed, having it within a centralized location that's always open and not just on market day.
Plus, it's in a building and not just in a like open market.
Right.
So you don't have to worry about the weather, and you don't have to worry about the seasons really that much. And it makes shopping so much more convenient. I mean, those ideas were primarily taken on by the higher society, like the richer society at first. So this idea was first hatched in Vienna. And to this day, I mean, there's one famous place that's still operating, although the owners have changed for like 10 times, I think, in the last 100 years. But there's a famous shopping mall called Gern Groß on the Marie-Hilfer-Straße in Vienna. Yeah. And there used to be one right next to it, which was called Herzmansky. Like those were two businessmen. One is called Gern Groß and one is Herzmansky. And
what stores are in there now?
Competing against each other. What stores are in there right now? Stores are changing all the time. I mean, the Gern Groß still has the Mediamarkt up there and some famous restaurants.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah, I've been in there. I've been in that little shopping center. It does feel different than what a normal mall would feel like. Feels a little bit more open maybe than what a modern mall. Obviously they've done a lot of renovation.
Yeah, they've done renovation over time and time again. So the building is actually super old, but they kind of went with the times. So every 20 years they would do like a major renovation of the place and make it look more modern.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't realize
the history of it comes actually from those years that we're talking about here, like in the early
malls.
The early malls. And if you walk down Marie-Hilfer-Straße towards the inner city, you come to the Stiftskirche and the Stiftsgasse.
Yeah.
So if you turn into the Stiftsgasse, turn left. Till this day, there's I think there's a cafe in the ground floor now, but there's this super old building, like the facade.
Yeah.
And it still says the word Herzmansky on it. So that was also owned by him. And you can see this is really like the Art Nouveau type of architecture. So that's what it originally looked like, if you can imagine. And if you just go back on the big street on Marie-Hilfer-Straße, it's just all modern and all like you can't see any evidence of the history any longer.
Sure.
So they invented it here in Vienna, and there was lots of innovation concerning how to be more productive, how to sell more, how to get the customers to come and come to your stores. And this idea of a mall was really brand new at that time. And this guy, he actually eventually went to the States and said, there's way more space here.
Yeah.
Let's make it
build them bigger. Very American of him.
Very American of him.
Yeah, I think that this concept of, I think Vienna now is kind of put into a middle tier of European cities for people to visit. Like it's not the first thing that people think of when they think of a European vacation. But it's crazy to think just even less than 150 years ago, it was quite the opposite. I mean, Vienna was really the hub. And that was, one of the interesting things from the podcast is that Vienna was really the source of a lot of culture and a lot of new construction techniques, a lot of philosophical thinking, economic thinking. There's a lot of things that really have driven the last 150 years of politics and economics that found their birth here in Vienna at the University of Vienna. Just interesting to consider like how one city could have that type of impact on the Western world.
Yeah.
A pretty cool place.
It's a pretty cool place. And I think, like I just pointed out, when people think of Austria, they would often think, okay, there's Mozart, there's Schnitzel, and there's the Sound of Music. Maybe those are the things that pop in someone's mind if they hear the word Austria.
Right.
And if they don't mistake it for Australia, first of all.
Right.
But to realize that, especially the Viennese culture at that time, and really it's the Viennese culture versus the rest of Austria. The rest of Austria is just completely different story, was the fact that so many great thinkers and so many inventors and all kinds of people who brought some great innovations into the world were at this place. I mean, one of the more famous names would be Sigmund Freud.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's not an exaggeration to say wherever if you ever see your therapist and if there's anything going on in terms of psychoanalysis, that idea was conceived in Vienna in the 19th century. Yeah,
that's right. I mean, it's so deep of an impact that I think sometimes people don't even realize like what they're being motivated by or what their responses are. Yeah, that's obvious. That's one of the obvious ones that people are pretty familiar with. But just all the amount of names that this guy was listing off that really had significant contributions, but like we don't really know their names.
There's no big statue of him like somewhere else.
Yeah, their name hasn't lived on in some sort of economic theory that we talk about. It wasn't named after him, but it really did have an impact on that interwar period. But then really in the post-World War II kind of reconstruction of society and the emergence of all these new technologies and philosophical thought, like that this was all coming out of, or a lot of this was really heavily influenced by the Viennese folks that had gotten out.
Yeah, and it ended at some point. That's also a fact. And he points out how the Nazis basically were to blame for that high society and this hub for innovation,
right?
To find an end as it used to be. It's Vienna still an innovative city in some ways, perhaps, but not as much as it used to be in those dimensions.
Yeah, and obviously a lot of reasons for that, but certainly the oppressive nature of the Nazi regime and the fact that many of these thinkers were coming from the Jewish community, and a lot of them probably exhibited traits and acted in ways that the Nazi regime did not approve of. And so they were the first to go. So there was this drain of everything that was making Vienna this hub that it just it lost that influence over time.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things that came out of it was talking about like the identity of Viennese people and how, the people that were here in Vienna at that time would consider themselves first as Viennese and not necessarily anything else of their identity. Is that something that you think as a Wiener yourself? Is that something that has maintained a grip on people here? Like if you ask somebody who they are or where they're from, are they strongly like, oh, I'm Viennese, or like I'm Austrian, I'm Catholic, I'm Christian, I'm Jewish, whatever. Like, is that like which identity do you think is the Viennese side as important of an identity still as it was then?
Probably not to be compared exactly like to the times more than 100 years ago. However, we did an episode in the first season about the differences between Vienna and the rest of Austria.
Oh, I have to go back and listen to that.
Yeah, go back and listen to that. It's also very recommendable. And I remember I at some point I mentioned that people from rest of Austria kind of look down on the Viennese, but the reason for that is because the Viennese look down on the rest of Austria. Yeah. So there's this kind of love-hate relationship happening between Vienna and all the other provinces. And I mentioned in that episode that sometimes when people from the rest of Austria move into Vienna and live there for some time, they actually adapt that and they become a little more arrogant towards the non-Viennese in Austria.
Yeah.
So in a way, the city border is also really a border of culture and identity to this day.
Yeah.
So I'd agree with that. And I think one of the main reasons is that if you lived in Vienna back then and even today, is if you want to make a living here, if you want to just survive here, you have to have a slightly different mindset than on the countryside, since it used to be way more this melting pot of this monarchy that was huge. It was like one of the biggest countries in Europe, with not only German speakers, but like different cultures and many different languages. So they all came to Vienna and they had to find a way to work together.
Yeah.
And certainly they had to adapt to the German language. And so, but still their own culture was still woven into into that city. And you can still see this all around the world with big cities. But I think that particular time, so in that sense, Vienna is way different than Berlin, for example. So Berlin is very, I want to use the term pure in the terms of the German culture. And maybe did not have as many people just moving in. Because if you think of Prague, if you think of Bratislava, and you think of Budapest, even back in the day, you can travel to Vienna in a fair amount of time.
Yeah.
Today, it's just a couple of hours by car or train. But since these places in Europe were so close together, they all centered around Vienna. It really made a best of. It's like a best of album.
Yeah.
If you're talking musical terms. So the best of the best came to Vienna. And to this day, the Viennese feel that they are the best, and that's where the arrogance sometimes also might come from, especially towards the people living in Lower Austria or Tyrol or anywhere else.
Yeah.
And speaking about that, what I kind of liked, what they were talking about in this podcast is, and I'm just summarizing in my own words, what they were saying in the end, in the history of humans and humankind, there's always some place where you just have to be there. If you want to be somebody, you got to be there. And you can probably date it back to like ancient Babylon. Sure. So if you want to be somebody, you have to move to that city, or if you're at some point in history was the city of Rome. If you want to be somebody, you have to be in Rome, and you got a job, get a job there, you get an education there, and maybe someday you'll make it. And so these places have been very influential on history, and to this day we have, echoes of the ancient cultures. Yeah. The Roman culture, especially in Europe, is still quite even visible. Yeah, literally. But speaking of London and speaking of Paris, they all had some time where they were really influential on the whole world. Yeah. And what this podcast, this episode, what the point that the author of the book makes is, for some time, it was Vienna. Yeah. For some decades, Vienna was that place. If you want to be somebody, you got to be in Vienna.
Yeah, it's that interesting like crossroads of political power, but then also like social and economic influence where, the thinkers of the day, the ones who are publishing new theories or who are actively involved in, philosophical discussions or whatever, they all always seem to kind of go together. They mentioned on the podcast New York as kind of a reason, but then on the West Coast with Silicon Valley, that was a place where everybody was going and they were coming from all over the place, but then taking on their own very unique identity that then spread out. So it's this melting pot coming in, and then that melting pot of soup gets scooped into other bowls. Not to kill a metaphor.
But you're trying really hard.
I'm trying real hard to kill it.
Good job,
but it does. I think that's the interesting thing about like human development over time is that there are these places, and very rarely do these places hold on to the things that are happening there. They get spread out. Because as the center of empires, whatever you want to see an empire as at that point, there's a natural spreading out into other locations. And it is kind of wild to think that now, looking at Vienna as a, beautiful city, fairly well run, but it doesn't have that same feel anymore. Yeah. Because it is just the echoes of all that past greatness.
Right. And as you said just now, like thinking about as we're alive today in this generation, if you think about, okay, if I want to be somebody, where would I have to go? And I think like the words, like the places like New York or the Silicon Valley, they come up, and just imagining, okay, we kind of understand this, especially Americans understand this, but even, like Europeans, they often would say like, if I want to make it, I'm going to move to America and go to New York or California for that matter. And I think we understand the concept, how it resonates, and just to be aware of it, that 150 years ago, Vienna would have been that place. So if you were growing up in, I don't know, Lisbon, Portugal, and say like, if you want to make it, you're going to move to Vienna. Yeah. It's just a fascinating thought about how the best of the best basically came together. And there's always this tendency of the best coming together in one spot, and they create like the arts and the sciences, and they influence each other so much. We talk the music, the composers, they were influenced by the political and the society, any development that was going on there. Think of Gustav Klimt, for example, was also living at that time. And also, as you just mentioned too, is that it all comes to an end. And I think probably the two main reasons are the two world wars, because after World War I, the whole monarchy collapsed. So Vienna used to be the capital city of basically Central Europe, if you want to put it this way.
Yeah.
And then it was no more. And then they lost influence already for economical reasons and for many other reasons. And then as the society became more and more radical and the Nazis in the 20s and the 30s started growing and becoming more influential, and then which led to World War II, I think that was the final blow to cast out any people who are thinking differently, because that was the beauty of it. You come here and you have this open-mindedness.
Yeah.
You can think of new ideas, and the Nazis were very much about, no, you have to think this way only, and then only this way. And so, and even if you were not a Jew or a political opponent of them, even with just like an artist living
if you
there,
didn't fit into the mold, then
it just became super unattractive to work and in that kind of environment.
Right.
So, plus, of course, many people were forced to leave.
Yeah.
Not to forget that.
Well, it has that long-lasting kind of effect that post-World War II, there were still people who, like, still the atmosphere and the mood in Vienna was probably closer to the closed offness of the Nazi regime than it was to the pre-World War I city where people come to learn. And so those echoes kind of continue and maybe are starting to be quieter or whatever.
Yeah. And for me, listening to it as a Viennese, as an Austrian, did I ever actually answer the question if I'm what I am?
I don't
Doesn't
think
matter.
you did. Maybe in a long way you did. I don't know.
But yes, of course, I identify as a Viennese, and I appreciate my hometown, this city very much. However, when we think about the course of history, we can also argue that the demise and the fall of that great society that was in place back then was also sort of self-made or self-harmed. Because one of the guys who responded to the calls, like, if you want to be somebody and make it, just go to Vienna, was also young Adolf Hitler.
Yeah, that's right.
And they also mentioned that in the podcast, how he was very much influenced by the ideas of the Viennese mayor at the time, Karl Lueger, who had already come up with anti-Semitic concept of like a point of view, worldview.
Yeah.
So the whole idea that the Jews were to blame for society's problems was not original with Hitler.
Right.
And maybe it was not original with Lueger either.
No, it wasn't.
But he was like a prominent figure who publicly lived according to those values.
It's interesting that is even a direct response to all the good things that were happening, because there were these elements that they thought were bad of having people from all over the region coming in and setting up their lives in Vienna. That was what made Vienna so great. But there was this fear that those outside influences or even internal influences were things that were going to eventually cause the downfall. But ironically, that response is what caused the downfall.
Yeah. The mayor of Vienna, Karl Lueger, he still there's a statue of him in Vienna, which is a very problematic statue. And there's always it tends
always
to be
some
on
protest.
The news. There's some protests going on, and they say, like, take it down. And people say, no, we have to remember our history. But there's some graffitis on it, and people just spraying all over and like call him a racist, which is not a false statement.
No,
but like how to deal with that history has become a challenge for the generations after now, like in our generation, in our time. So how to deal with that legacy. And perhaps one big takeaway a practical takeaway for our listeners, since we just don't want to talk about ancient history and say, well, that's in the past. And
a lot more schnitz and a lot less giggles in this episode.
That's
but
true.
It's
true.
There's some
we can
heavy topics to talk about.
We saved all the giggles for the last part, a couple seconds.
Oh boy, here it comes.
The takeaway from all of this is, I mean, you can go to a shopping mall anywhere in the world and you don't have to care about, okay, it was a Viennese person who invented that. Yeah, I just want to buy my shoes and my my stuff, my clothes there.
Just want to go to Orange Julius.
Okay.
Hot dog on a stick.
Okay, perhaps. Hot dog on a stick. Okay.
Yeah. Classic food court, American mall food court places.
Yeah, I'm talking about the Frankfurt and the Wiener Wurst and everything. That takes us back to episode 1.
That's right.
Also comes from here. However, what I was going to talk about, just as we wrapping up here, is just when you move to Vienna, if you live in Vienna and you meet the people, the local people, and you wonder why they're so weird in many ways, maybe it helps you to understand a little bit the mindset of the Viennese. Because the mindset of the Viennese is kind of stuck, sometimes it's stuck in that time period where Vienna meant greatness. Yeah. And that kind of greatness has faded away, like an objective point of view here. But that greatness is still, I wouldn't say, in the hearts of the locals. And maybe, in a way, the Viennese society, just general speaking, I can't speak for every individual, but in general, they couldn't let go of that until now. Plus, you have to consider, we're being reminded of this history on a constant basis because we pass by not only statues, but beautiful buildings and beautiful architecture and paintings and everything that's still here.
Yeah.
And it tells us that those buildings speak to us and say, like, this is the greatness that we used to have and used to be. And where is it now?
Yeah.
And I think that shapes the Viennese mindset a lot to this day. So if you're wondering why Viennese might come across a little arrogant or saying, like, I want to
protect what we have.
Yeah, and you've probably been in that situation as well, where like a Viennese would maybe sit down with you and tell you why Vienna is greater than all of America.
Sure.
And or any other country. Yeah. That maybe comes from that idea that we lost it and we can't get it back, and we don't maybe feel even appreciate it.
Yeah, that sense that we're, you're kind of reminded of the once greatness.
The once greatness.
Oof.
Yeah.
Is that? Yeah, the greatness that once was.
I'm not going to correct your English here.
Yeah, well, maybe you should.
Maybe I should.
Yeah, it was both protected and then rebuilt in the post-war years. That it's still all here.
Yeah.
And from right now where we sit, we're a 15-minute subway ride to seeing all this, to walking through the Hofburg Palace and just being amongst all these buildings where these great thinkers or great inventors or whatever were also walking. And I think the echoes of those footsteps and as they said in the podcast, like the ghosts of this time period, they still influence kind of the mentality and the mindset.
Right. And some of the coffee places are still the exact same places.
Right.
That those great thinkers were sitting and debating ideas that were revolutionary at that time. And great things came, or great and bad things, both we have to say, came of that. And you can still have a coffee, maybe not the same, maybe even some of the furniture might still be the same. Like it's that kind of tangible.
Yeah.
But yet it's so far away. And I think that living with that kind of mindset maybe produces the melancholy of the Viennese people to some extent.
Yeah.
How sad.
Wow. Melancholy. Schnitz and giggles. We've changed
our
our pattern a little bit. Well, yeah, why not come and walk through the streets of Vienna and get a feel for it's not just looking. It can get really easy to just kind of get overwhelmed by the fact that all the buildings are old. And if you're just kind of looking at them on a surface level, it's just kind of, okay, it's another set of old buildings, but that there is some pretty significant stuff to be seeing and looking around at and enjoying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just,
all right.
I think it would be good to recognize these things in your personal life. I mean, you have a house, you drive a car. I mean, houses are pretty old, but cars are not that old. You drive a car, which is also...
Oh, I don't.
But even the whole idea of the inventions of computers and cars and everything, I mean, mainly also the Germans have a word to say in this.
Sure.
But thinking of the German-speaking society was kind of very much connected in that time as it is maybe today. But scientists and everything, it's just, there's so much that was new like a century ago. And if it was new a century ago, it was probably coming out of Germany or of Vienna.
Yeah, this part of the world, at least.
This part of the world.
So the impact of our thinking and our creative design can certainly last far longer than your own life and your own memory. So
yeah, I mean,
so don't do stupid things, listeners.
Yeah, appreciate
Be positive.
I'd say
influencers.
I don't know if you know that the sewing machine was also invented by an Austrian. So anytime you wear clothes that are not sewn by hand, you got to thank Austria for the fact that you have some clothes on.
So that's a good point.
That's a good point.
You've really stuck it there. So
and you don't know how to get out of this now.
Guten bye-bye.
Okay, I guess it is just guten bye-bye. Thanks for listening to this Schnitz and Giggles episode.
Remember to follow and subscribe if you want more content like this from the Edelweiscrackers.
Don't be shy about commenting or leaving feedback. Until next time.
So long.
Farewell.
Good Wiedersehen.
Bye-bye.